Not in the front 8 rows, you're going to need to move up to the front 8 rows.
If you're behind me, that is not the front 8 rows. Move up.
There's last space, so
this row is completely empty. If you are in this row, you still need to move up. This row right here.
Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to the Critique Seminar for the 2-3-week labs, the SCI. My name is B. I've introduced myself before, but as a refresher, I'm a graduate assistant at Wayne State. I debated for Indiana when I was in high school, and East Kentwood Indiana when I was in college, East Kentwood when I was in high school. I was, for the vast majority of my career, a critique debater. I read a lot of different types of criticisms, both on the app and the NAG. So I have a decent amount of knowledge about different theories and also about how to read the critique. I was fairly successful doing it as a debater. So hopefully I can help you all out. I know there's a lot, that you'll have a lot of questions about critiques because they're kind of complicated. They have confusing words, and you might not know exactly how to read them. That's okay. That's what the seminar is for. So, to begin, what is critique? If you notice, critique can be spelled both with a K, K-R-I-T-I-K, or like this, with a C and a Q. That's a linguistic difference that we'll talk about later. It's irrelevant. But the word critique is a verb, right? You critique someone or something. Right? So it's not just something that exists kind of nebulously, it's not just statements, right? But it's something that you do. Right? Unlike a disadvantage, which is a description of what the act might cause, critique is a process. So if you recall Will's lecture on Tuesday, critique is a process of systematic investigation into the underlying assumptions of a particular position. And that position can be a policy, which it often is in the case of debate. It can be someone's rhetoric. Can someone tell me what rhetoric means? Yeah. Loud. You have to be very loud. I can't hear you. There's an air right there. So. Yeah, so rhetoric is, it has to do with speaking. It has to do with the words that you use. And also some other related concepts about how language operates. You know, and there are other things you can critique as well. You can also critique, you know, things that happen in your everyday lives, things that you have experienced. All of that is part of a critique. So we're going to break this down further in just a second. But it's important to know that critique is a process. That it's something that occurs, right? But it's not something that happens once and then is done. So let's break this down a little bit. Critique as a process. What does it mean for a critique to be a process? You know, you get up in the 1NC and you read your citizenship critique, right? You talk about a government for a little bit, and you propose an alternative. I still have time, don't worry. But that doesn't exist in a vacuum. The authors that you're reading, the literature that you're deriving your arguments from, is part of a long tradition of what's called critical theory, where people, scholars, activists, people in their everyday lives will go and they'll try and understand why the things that are occurring are. Not just what is happening, but why do those things occur. So it's a process of investigation, as I said earlier, which means it's continuous. It keeps going. Critique doesn't seek to find a truth about the world. In fact, most critical authors would argue that there is no singular truth that's out there for us to find, right? That there's no right answer to most questions that we have, especially when you think about things like politics, right? Social systems, power, economics. All of these things are interrelated and very, very complicated. The world that we live in is one of complexity. So we have to continuously critique what's happening, because sometimes our critiques don't hold up to new developments. So for example, does anyone here know who Karl Marx is? Yeah, so Karl Marx was is oftentimes considered one of the more important people within critical theory. Karl Marx developed the theory of communism. He wrote a few books about it, Das Kapital, the Communist Manifesto, and a few other things. Right, but he was writing in the 1800s and the early 1900s. And the world's a little different then, right? We didn't have electricity, by and large, for a lot of people. There was industrialization, but there wasn't the internet, right? So sometimes our theories need to be updated to understand what's currently happening in the world. Even theories from, for example, 5 years ago might not take into account the election of Donald Trump, for example, and we might need to continuously update our critique and our theories about how the world operates. So it's continuous and it's reflexive. What does it mean for something to be reflexive? Yeah. Yeah, so it applies to itself. It's when you have a reflection in a mirror, right, you can see yourself. So when I say that critique is reflexive, then that means that it's never satisfied with itself. It's always questioning, it's always skeptical, and it's always questioning. It never presumes to have reached the truth or a conclusion, right? But rather argues that we should develop methods for understanding the world. And that those methods are always open to improvement. That if a better method comes along, we should utilize that. So a lot of people think that critical theory and critiques are, for example, anti-scientific, right? They're not based in reality, right? They don't use statistics, right, to understand the world. But that's the point of critiquing, is that once you've done a critique of a particular position, you could be wrong. And that's what the critique is asking. That we have assumptions about the world, we have values that we place on the world, and that those are always open to interpretation, they're open to question, and that we should be reflexive not only of the system or the thing that we're critiquing, but we should be reflective of ourselves and our position within that critique. Critique means, and our position, which means that we have to understand, right, that there's not some magical deal that if we lived it, the world would be better, but that it's a constant process of struggle. Critique is also an investigation. When you think of investigation, right, you might think of a detective, right, from a TV show. Or you might think of investigative journalism. Critique, just like investigative journalism, is an attempt to uncover things about the world. Previously hidden or unknown truths, information, or knowledge about the world. So when Marx started writing the Communist Manifesto, right, he was trying to uncover the economic and socio-political system that produced all of the violence that he saw in the world. When Agamben, for example, is writing about the state of exception, or is writing about sovereignty, Agamben is attempting to uncover hidden understandings of how the law operates and how the state manages violence and life through biopolitics. So critiques are attempt to uncover and expose that previously hidden or unexplored information, knowledge, or truth about the world. Critique is an iterative process. When I was talking earlier about critique being a process and it being continuous, it's iterative. It builds upon itself. So when we update our theories, we don't get rid of what was before, right? But we attempt to make them better, to make them fit what's currently happening, and to try and have them have explanatory value, make them be able to explain why things occur. So Marx had questions. He was like, you know, why is the economy set up this way? Why is there massive wealth inequality, etc.? And then he attempted to find a method to determine why that is, right? So you can do that with a lot of different things. I saw a hand somewhere. Yeah.
Can a critique ever evolve so much that it becomes like contrary to what the original idea was?
So that's a great question. The question was, can a critique ever evolve so much that it becomes contradictory or contrary to what the original idea of the critique was, or the original method of the critique was? The answer is yes, all the time, and this happens constantly. A lot of critical authors...
Can you give an example?
Yeah.
Something that's gone from like, okay, this, and then eventually just goes to the opposite.
For sure. Going back to the example of Marxism, right? Marx had this idea about the way that the economy operates, etc. That there are neo-Marxists, neo meaning new, right, or current, right? So there are neo-Marxists who argue that, well, Marx had some great ideas about how capitalism operates. Those ideas are no longer relevant to the way that like neoliberalism operates. And there was a shift in what occurred, and now there are still people who defend Marxist theory about how the economy operates, but there are other people who are like, not so much. It's not just a question of, you know, land, labor, and capital, but there's also other things involved, especially considering globalization, the internet, etc. And those neo-Marxists, right, and post-structuralists, a bunch of other people, these are all terms that are not super important right now, right, but they disagree. And sometimes people will develop theories that will disagree with previous theories that they themselves had developed. So a great example of this happening is that in 2001, on September 11th, the US was attacked, and the World Trade Center was bombed, amongst other things. That signaled a giant shift in many critical theorists' understanding of how the world operated. Because in that moment, and because of that event, a lot of the theories that we had about how power operated, about how the state operated, were totally irrelevant, because there was a new kind of formation of power that emerged. Another great example of this is that a lot of people have written post-Trump and have, you know, totally changed their understanding of how the world operates, because their previous theories did not account for the possibility of, you know, a figure like Trump arising in democratic politics. So it's iterative, and sometimes it will iterate itself so much, it will change so much that it becomes unrecognizable as the original theory that it was. But that's not a problem, right? That is actually great, because it means that our theories are always trying to explain the world that we live in, and not some past world that we have no understanding of, because we don't currently experience it. It's a great question. Yes, certainly. Additionally, because it's an investigation, it's ongoing, which means it never stops. You've never reached the point where you're done critiquing. You continuously have to revise, like I was saying, revise your theories, but it also means that there's no kind of end point, which can be good or it can be bad, depending on what you want to do with critique. So it's ongoing. Finally, critique deals with assumptions. What is an assumption? Yeah?
Something that you believe without questioning why.
Right, exactly. So an assumption is something you assume to be true, that you believe it, and it just is true. You don't really question it. Yeah. Louder, much louder.
So assumption is something we have to believe what it really is.
right, something that the app thinks is true, but maybe potentially isn't. And then you can utilize that in order to make arguments, right? So an assumption is also, right, it's all those things, it's beliefs, but it's also a system of evaluation and decision making. So when I say it's a system of evaluation, what I mean by that is that when we have to choose between competing options, right, between the plan and the alternative, right, or between, for example, capitalism and communism, we have to make certain evaluations about what we value in the world, and then that affects how we make decisions. And most of politics is just evaluation and decision making. How do we value life? How do we value the distribution of resources? And who should get, basically who gets what and how, right, is classically what government is defined as doing. And those are all dealing with assumptions about value. That, for example, in America, in the capitalist society that we live in, we have an assumption that people should work, right? And that's just, generally true. We value hard work as an American ethic, and that there's just this unwritten assumption. There's an assumption, right, that if you want to get a good job, you'll go to college after you graduate high school. But that's not always inherently true, right? You don't need to get a college degree to have a good job. You don't need a job to have a fulfilling life. The only reason these things look true is because of the system that we live in that says that these things have to be true. But when humans are born, there's no innate drive to have a job where you go to an office 9 to 5 every day and sit in a cubicle and stare at your computer and enter numbers. That's not like an innate drive that humans have to do, right? That's something that you have to do in order to survive in the world that we live in, but it's not something that is inherent to the human experience. So when we're talking about assumptions, we're talking about the ways in which a position assigns value to different things, and then makes decisions based off of that value. Assumptions are often unspoken, which is the thing we heard earlier, and unacknowledged, because they're assumed to be true. They just are true things. We don't need to talk about them. We don't need to acknowledge them, because we all know that these things are true, right? We all know that you need to make money to survive. And that's just true. So it's unspoken and it's unacknowledged. Remember earlier, critique is an investigation, right? So these assumptions, because they're unspoken and unacknowledged, oftentimes go unchallenged in public discourse. Does anyone know what the word discourse means? Yeah.
What do the role talk about in relation to wider social events?
Close. So the answer was what people normally talk about in relation to events. That's in the right track. I like where your head's up. It's not exactly correct. Yeah. Louder. Yeah, so exactly, discourse, conversation, speaking to one another. You might hear words like dialogue, which is associated with discourse. So discourse is both the words that you speak, and it's also, like rhetoric, kind of some of the social factors that affect what gets to be spoken. So we're talking about assumptions, we're talking about things that are related to debates that are occurring, right? So when you have a debate, there are certain assumptions that go into that. If you get up and say that the DREAM Act would be super great for the economy and the military, and that's why it's a good idea to do, and the negative gets up and is like, no, but it would actually really depress wages, and it would cause the midterms politics to set, right? Both sides have assumed and agreed to the same system of evaluation. They both agreed and conceded to a utilitarian calculus to understand how we should evaluate policy, right? And that assumption is unspoken and unacknowledged. If you were to critique the affirmative, you might say, hey, maybe this kind of understanding, right, of utilitarianism, of the greatest good for the greatest number, is actually problematic when we actually look at the kind of assumptions that the DREAM Act might make about citizenship, what it might make about the military, and what it might make about things like settler colonialism. So, the critique is a process of investigating assumptions. It's continuous, it's ongoing, and it's an attempt to uncover previously hidden or unspoken knowledges or truths about the world. Okay. Does anyone have any general questions? That's generally what a critique is. Does anyone have any questions about that concept. Okay, yes?
So, I don't know this right now, but aren't critique, some debaters also argue that their critique in the debate space is also supposed to affect the lack of that debate space, which you critique is supposed to that after the judgment that you're not critiquing the debate space, but also interaction outside of it as well.
Yeah, so the question is, some people argue that the critique affects not just the debate that is currently occurring, but also the world outside of it. And that's a good point to make, is that one of the, we've described what a critique is, right? But we haven't really described why. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we critiquing? And a lot of critical theorists argue that kind of bringing to light those unspoken and unacknowledged assumptions causes people to question them. If you have never heard, if you have never, for example, heard from your school, which is probably true, that capitalism causes a bunch of violent things to occur, and someone gets up and is like, no, actually, the economic system that we have is not some neutral entity, but rather does all these terrible things like sweatshops and wage exploitation, etc. That might be the first time that the person you're engaging with has had to think about those assumptions about capitalism. And that might encourage them to change their understanding, their relationship, and their views on the subject. So when people in debate say that you should vote for the alternative because it has an out-of-ground effect or an out-of-debate effect, that's what they're arguing about, is that critical theorists think, defend that the work that they're doing, the actual research process that they're doing, is one that has the potential to affect the world. Yeah?
How is that with the affirmative claim that they have not knowledge to some degree on the subject prior?
So the question is, can the affirmative say they have knowledge prior? What do you mean by the word prior?
Like if someone had already done a bunch of research in their free time about the sweatshop system in regards to, for example, clothing distribution, could they claim in the debate that you weaken the solvency of the alternative?
So there's like so the question is, if someone has already done critique that weaken the solvency of the alternative, we'll get more specific into alternative in a minute, and solvency and all those questions. But generally, remember that critique is an ongoing process. It's iterative, right? Which means you're never finished. You never did the research and then you're done. There are always things that are hidden that you can find more about. And it's not just research like, reading books and stuff, right? But it's about analyzing social situations that occur. So there's always new things to analyze, new things that are occurring in the world, and new things to kind of understand. Good question. Okay. So any other questions about what a critique is? Yeah.
I have more just a general question about it. So NAG is often supported in status quo.
Be louder.
NAG is often supported in status quo. But isn't a critique the exact opposite of that?
Yes, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Great question. The question was, isn't a critique kind of the opposite of a defense of the status quo? And the answer is yes, most of the time. But we'll talk about that more in just a second. Any other questions about what a critique is? Okay, awesome. So before we kind of get into the mechanics of how you read a critique and answer a critique in a debate round, there are different categories of critique, different things that critiques talk about, and different kind of focuses that they have. So one important category is the word epistemology. Right? This is a word that you heard in Will's lecture. Does anyone remember what the definition of epistemology is? Maybe someone haven't heard from? Yeah?
How do you know what you know?
How you know what you know? Yeah? Any other thoughts? Yeah? Yeah? Like 3 times as loud. Study of knowledge, yep, exactly. And I saw a hand over there. Okay, awesome. So epistemology, the study of knowledge. Break it down into the kind of root of it. Epistem is knowledge or information, and ology is study. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, or the study of how we know what we know. So these critiques deal with things like research practices. When you represent something, whether it be through statistics or through description, right? You always have to make choices about what you're leaving in and what you're leaving out. And that's what epistemology is concerned with. How did we come to the conclusions that we reached, and what methodologies did we use to do that? Next category is ontology. Anyone define the word ontology for me that I haven't heard from yet? Yeah. Study of being. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Okay. Any other thoughts on what ontology might be? Yeah.
Maybe like how the world or the situation.
Can you be louder? Everyone needs to be way louder. I can't hear anyone.
How the world or the situation is, like study how like the world is.
Yeah, so the study of how the world is, yes. So ontology also translates, it does translate into the study of being, onto being, ology, the study of. Ontology is arguments about kind of the manifestation of the world, the way that the world is, how humans are in particular, and how we relate to that world around us and one another. So an epistemological argument might ask, how do we come to know something to be true? The ontological question might ask, what is truth? Right? So when you hear someone talk about ontology, they're making a claim about the kind of structure of the world. They're like, the world is this way. And if we use ontology, we can understand how the world works by understanding what it is. There are also rhetorical criticisms. So criticisms of the rhetoric that you use, which includes not just the words race. You may have heard of things like criticizing particular words. There are a lot of, for example, ableist metaphors that people use in their language. And these evidence might say that the economy would be crippled. That is an ableist metaphor because it presumes a certain level of normality of bodies, and that it is a negative thing to be a cripple. That's a particular type of rhetorical criticism, but there are also rhetorical criticisms that deal with the relationship between words. So it's not just particular words, right? But that the way that you talk about something might be relevant to the kind of other considerations that you have about it. So, for example, in the topic lecture that Will Repko gave, he talked a little bit about, or in the packet, sorry, he talked a little bit about the differences between the term like chain migration and family reunification, right? So those are specific terms, but they're associated with kind of a larger understanding of what it means. So if someone is using the term chain migration, you can kind of analyze that term and understand through their use of it that they have an entire political ideology that's usually conservative and is related to that understanding. But if someone uses the term family reunification, you can understand how that relates to other terms and understand that that person probably has a more liberal ideology about how immigration should operate. Yeah?
I get that. When you say like the difference between like chain migration and family reunification, what is some of the liberal ideology says chain migration did not,
Can you be louder?
So let's say someone with a liberal ideology uses the chain migration as family reunification, and someone in Canada can't just like, yeah, I didn't really think of it, that's not the intention.
Yeah, so that's a great question. What if someone uses a term but they don't have the intention that you would assume based off of your research, right? So you've done some research. It's like people that use the word chain migration generally have this type of ideology, but someone might have a different ideology and still use the term because they don't know the implications of it, right? A critic would argue that the intention of the speaker, right, or the intention of the actor is usually not a relevant consideration, and that in fact oftentimes the rhetorical choices that we have, regardless of our professed ideologies, occur at a subconscious level, that we utilize terms that fit into our ideology, even if we profess to have a totally different understanding of the world, which is a psychoanalytic concept, not always true, and certainly not like the truth about the world, right? But a lot of critical theorists would argue that intentions are not super relevant when you're discussing the ideological and practical effects of any particular rhetorical device or epistemology or ontology. Yeah?
So then, to respond to that sort of like if you have like psychological parts that argue that their assumption that this ties into our subconsciousness regardless of our best beliefs as everyone's moral approach that we have enough to be able to rhetoric argument. Okay.
I mean, it's a debate to be had, right? None of these things are, capital T truth. Potentially that's an answer to that argument, right? But another argument is that regardless of the intention, the harm associated with using particular words or particular rhetorical choices can also be relevant. So if you use the word chain migration, even if you have no evil intentions behind it, that word, when it's circulated in discourse, right, when people use it, brings up certain kind of understandings of the world. And that those understandings make it easier to do repressive and violent immigration policies, regardless of your intention. So you can make the argument, there's debate to be had, but there are other arguments as well. The next category is material. So there are critiques of the material effects of policies. And this is oftentimes not included in this kind of section of categories of critique, but I think it's really important. So there are a lot of critiques that deal with the implications of if the policies that the Act is talking about were to be implemented. So the militarism critique, for example, well, it does talk about epistemology and ontology, right? How the military affects how we know what we know to be true and what we believe to be true, and what the military's relationship to things in the world is. It also operates on a material level, where the critique argues that if the plan passed, there would be more people in the military, and the military would be more powerful, and they would do bad things with that power, right? It's about the material implications, not about, it is about an assumption, but not as much as the other ones. It's about, the consequence of enacting the plan. The citizenship dissent, for example, argues that the plan, enrolling people into the DREAM Act, would require data surveillance, right? That you have to submit your name to the government and say, I'm undocumented, here's my name, here's my address, here's all of my school records, etc., right? And then in the future, all of that can be used against those folks for targeting purposes. That is a material consequence of the planned action that is related to the assumptions it makes, but is not solely an epistemological or ontological argument. Yeah?
Can you say material, is that referring to the act of the government collecting information or the information itself? Right, so the plan is also information being collected, is it the act of the material, or is it the information that the act of document?
It's all material. Material in this sense just refers to not theoretical. It's like the kind of contra of theoretical. So a lot of critiques are like, theoretically this is the things that would occur, but this is like, if the policy were to occur, here's your material thing. Not just that it reifies a concept of citizenship or that it is part of a settler colonial law system, right? But that there's like an actual thing that would occur that you can point directly to, that you can be like, this is the bad thing that would occur if it were to occur. Not just that the act supports settler colonialism or that the act has assumptions that may be racist, but that these things would happen to make certain people's lives worse.
So the other one's kind of like conjecture about like mindset, or is it just like actual result of the act?
Conjecture is an interesting word. I don't know if I would call it conjecture, because it's a rigorous kind of methodological system. So it's not just like people are randomly saying things, right? It's based off of evidence and examples and experience. So it's not conjecture, right? But it's more kind of about the values that we have, how we place value, and less about the actual policy that gets enacted. Yeah. We need it way louder. What makes it different from what we just said? And that's a great question. We'll get to it in literally just a second when we talk about the parts of the critique. But great question. Keep that in mind. We'll be there in just a minute. Anything else before we move on? So there can be material critiques of the material implementation of the plan. And then there can finally be pedagogical critiques. What does the word pedagogy mean? Does anyone have a guess that I haven't heard from yet? Sweater? Yeah. Okay, it's all good. Anyone else? Haven't heard from? Yeah. Yeah, the process. So the process of acquiring knowledge is the answer. Pedagogy is how we teach, right? So if epistemology is how we know, pedagogy is how we teach. So a critique about pedagogy might argue that kind of the lessons that could be derived from the affirmative's research, while it might have epistemological or ontological problems, when they get taught, that can have bad implications because it causes students, young folks that are learning these things to have messed up conceptions about the world. Exactly right. So the study of teaching pedagogy. Right, does anyone have any questions about any of these 5 categories? Something to keep in mind is that they're not exclusive from one another. So if you are really interested in the Agamben criticism and the citizenship K, you can have arguments from that field of literature that deal with all 5 parts of this. So most critical theorists will write about a lot of different things. They'll write about epistemology, they'll write about ontology, they'll write about rhetoric, they'll write about materialism, and they'll write about pedagogy. And some other things as well, right? But it's not like you have a solely epistemological critique, right? But that this is a category of argumentation within critique. Yeah?
So when running a case, how many of these categories can you be able to come to us on other arguments?
It depends on what the critique is, what the other arguments are, how much time you want to invest into it. If you're reading a one-off criticism, you should probably have an argument about all of these things. You might want to, if you're reading just like a short criticism that focuses on one particular thing we acted, you might want to focus in more. But really, it also depends on which particular literature base you're reading. So it's really contextual to the round and to the arguments below you. Yeah. Right. So the question is, can the alternative be pedagogical, is the conjugation. And the answer is it can be, certainly. The alternatives can do a lot of different things. We'll get to the alternative in just a second, talk about all the different things it can do. But that's a great question. The alternative in the citizenship case, for example, is about curriculum, which is a pedagogical argument about what we should be teaching and what we should be including in our research. It's also a little bit of this one. Yeah. Gotta be louder. Yeah. So explain material again. So a material critique argues that the consequences of the hypothetical enactment of the affirmative plan right, if we were to pass the DREAM Act, that there would be specific material things that would be violent or bad. In this case, the passing of the DREAM Act, well, it may have assumptions about citizenship and what it means to be a citizen or whatever. The material bad thing it does is the data surveillance argument that we were talking about earlier. In the militarism case, well, it certainly has arguments about the way that the military has manipulated our knowledge and the way that we learn and the way that we think. It also says that, materially, the implementation of the DREAM Act would increase the power of the military, and then they would do bad things with that power, right? So it's about if you can point to a specific thing that the act would do that is relevant to what you're talking about, then that's more of a material implication of what the criticism does. Does that clarify? Awesome. Cool. All right, any other questions before we move on? All right, so now we're going to get more into the weeds, into the nitty-gritty of debating or critique, and how you do that in a debate. So we kind of know already that a critique is a process. It's an investigation and it attempts to uncover assumptions. We know that there are different things, different types of categories of critiques, so different assumptions that you could criticize, and different types of assumptions you can criticize. But how do we do it? How do we put all this together in a debate round? Do you just get up and start randomly ranting about how much you hate your job and your boss, or is there a systematic way to do it? The answer is that it's not ranked. If you are ranting, you're doing it wrong. So the first part of the critique, is a link. And these very similar to what a link at a disadvantage is. But if you'll notice, what's the first part of a disadvantage? Uniqueness. There's no uniqueness in a critique, and that we'll talk about that more in a minute. But the link is the first part, and we'll talk about that more as well. Second part, impact. Just like a disadvantage, bad thing that would occur, or is occurring, right? So oftentimes critiques are not predictive of the future, but they're descriptive of what's going on now. And then the alternative. If you have some beef with something that's going on in the status quo, let's say, you are a socialist and you got some beef with the way that resources are being distributed in the status quo, you can write an alternative method, right? An alternative vision for what the world could be. advocacy of the negative, the other thing that we should do instead of not only what the act did, but also the thing that's occurring in the status quo, right? The act may be capitalist, but capitalism is already happening. So we have to propose an alternative to that system. And then finally, framework, which is the frame by which we evaluate the debate. What things are important when the judge is considering voting at the end of the debate? Yeah?
What impacts are valued the most?
Is that a question?
I'm answering.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So it's about impacts for sure, but it's also about definitely about impacts, but it's also about like, are we evaluating the app on an epistemological level? Are we evaluating the app on an implementation level? Right. So some critiques argue that the passing of the plan and whether or not the DREAM Act is good or bad is an irrelevant consideration to the debate, because the debate is actually about the knowledge that we use to produce our arguments, right? So framework says that there are some impacts or some arguments that matter more than others, and some that matter less. Yeah?
And then, if you use the framework to kind of like narrow down or discover this argument that they really go about,
yeah, so the question was, can you use framework to narrow down the focus of the case? And the answer is yes. So like the framework for the debate is that we should only look at epistemology. Right, and that only epistemological arguments are important. That could be a framework in a way to look at the case. You can also use framework. It doesn't have to be that way. You can use a very broad interpretation of what framework is. So these are the 4 parts. All right, so the link. The link is what assumptions does the act make? What is the bad thing that they did? That when the act put together their 1AC and they got up and they read it for 8 minutes at the beginning of the speech, what about that was objectionable? So you need to make arguments and you question how the act is supporting whatever system you're critiquing. So if your critique is about anti-blackness, right, you have to have a reason why what the act did was part and parcel of that system of anti-blackness. Right? You can't just get up and be like, anti-blackness is super important, which is a true argument. If you don't have a reason why the act affects it, then you don't have a link argument to the criticism. So how, this is a question to answer. How about you go about showing evidence and proof for your link arguments? This relates earlier to the question of intention. Someone haven't heard from? You that just looked at me? What do you think? How much you go about showing evidence for your argument? Any thought that you have? Be loud, like I can't hear. There's a fan right here. Yeah. So just like a disadvantage, you can use evidence from other authors, from sources. You can go and you can read a book and you can get evidence out of that book. That's one way for sure. Definitely. That's the main way that a lot of evidence is produced. Yeah. Right. You can look at the words that they use, make arguments based off of that. Yeah.
Use personal narratives.
Chris, you can talk about your experiences and how those relate to what the affirmative has said. The question is, what's to stop someone from making up a personality? Well, first, people should not be shady to one another. You shouldn't just make up random stuff to win a debate round as an ethical concern. And second is that the kind of what we consider to be evidence, things like statistics or expert opinion or whatever, are equally as subjective as someone's personal experience. Because they all are dependent upon certain ideological assumptions, which is what the purpose of critiquing is. So there are certainly arguments to be made that personal experience is perhaps not the best form of evidence, right? But there's also arguments to be made that other forms of evidence are equally as bad. So it's a debate to be had, as everything else is. Any other? I saw some hands back here. No? Yeah.
Adding on to rhetoric that creates the context as really certain
Context.
that were applied to a certain
the answer was about using context when we're looking at rhetoric. Context is super, super important. Great answer. Very, very important for critiques. Can someone tell me what context is? Someone that I haven't heard from? Yeah. So the scenario in which the term or assumption was used in. I like where your head's at. Very close. Any other thoughts? Someone I haven't heard from? All right, what do you got?
Maybe like the history of the problem that you're critiquing leading up to the app. So it's like, oh yeah, America, like the United States federal government has had history of yada 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 because the problem that is the United States federal government, and then the plan just furthers this bad thing.
For sure, for sure. So history, and the history of the problem that you're looking at, definitely important. Yep. So background and relations, so its relationship to other things, right? So context, right? And if you think about it, what does con mean as a prefix? No, con means opposite. Not in Spanish. It's a prefix.
The opposite of pro.
So, yeah, it's the opposite of pro, right? Con. Okay, so con means the opposite of. So text, right? The text, the 1AC, the speech act of the 1AC is the text, right, that the critique is analyzing. The context, right, is everything that the 1AC is related to that is not the speech act of the 1AC. Right? So it's the research that was produced, it's the theories that the 1AC espouses, it's the history behind the 1AC that's maybe not explicitly stated, right? That's all context, right? The things that are not included in the text. Personal reference. And by bringing in context, right, and by looking at context, you can make arguments about the assumptions that the app is making, because you can see how those strains of thought developed over time. Originally what they were, what they are now, and you can also see how those in the past may have affected, how those assumptions may have affected other policies to make kind of guesses about how they might affect policy in the future. Okay, so those are all great ideas about how to show different links to the affirmative. Does anyone have any question about the link? So next is the impact. Why is the thing that you're critiquing bad? If you just get up and you're like, you know, the app, super capitalist, they really like the economy, we should do socialism, sit down. What have you mixed? Yeah.
Why?
You gotta be real loud.
You have to explain why capitalism is bad.
Right, you don't have a reason why it's bad that the app is capitalist. So you have to have a reason why the thing that you are critiquing is bad. Or you're not going to win the debate. Similar to like with a dissent, if you just go up and you're like, you know, Dems win the midterms now, the app stops Dems from winning, and you sit down. You don't have an impact. There's no reason why that's bad. So just like a dissent, you have to have an impact to your critique. Now there are generally two styles of impacts for critiques. Can someone maybe guess one of them, or what you think might be a style of impact for a critique? Yeah. Yeah, so like a terminal impact that you might find in dissent. Yep, and that is what's considered a consequentialist impact. That is about the consequences of the plan, right? Or of the system. So, like when we're talking about material, for example, those are usually consequentialist. It's a consequence of the plan happening, right? Or it's a consequence of, for example, letting capitalism continue unabated. That it might destroy the environment, or might cause a war, right? That those are consequences of something that might happen in the future. What is another potential type of impacts? The green shirt. Yeah, you. Looking at it right now. You have an idea? No? All right. All right. Any other ideas? In the blue gray shirt. Who said that and say much louder?
Moralistic?
Yeah, morals, yeah. So you can have consequential impacts. You can have impacts that are about morals and ethics, right? That the thing that the app did was unethical. Not that it has any particular bad consequences, but that the app has espoused a policy that is settler colonial, and that it's unethical to do things that are settler colonial, or is immoral. Yeah.
It's sort of like the
You
ontology.
gotta be way louder than that.
It's sort of like the ontology and utilitarianism.
You gotta be way louder than that.
It's sort of like the ontology and utilitarianism.
Yeah, very similar. Yeah, definitely. Ontology and utilitarianism are definitely related to critique debate for sure. So you can read either of these impacts or both types, right? You can say that capitalism not only will destroy the environment, but it's also an unethical system. So if the app is capitalist, there's multiple reasons why that's a bad thing, right? But the impact is the bad thing, why the thing that you're critiquing is bad. And then there's the alternative. The alternative is what the negative proposes to resolve the thing that they're critiquing. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? But there's a lot more to the alternative than just what are you proposing, right? If the negative just gets up and it's like, capitalism sucks, the act is capitalist, we should do socialism, right? There's a lot of different ways to attack that. You can say that socialism is bad, right? Or you can say that they don't cause socialism to occur because capitalism is super entrenched. So you have to, when you think of the alternative, think about what exactly the alternative is doing. Because there's a lot of different avenues through which to try and change the world around us, right? So alternatives can be both descriptive and or proscriptive. What does it mean for something to be descriptive? Yeah. So it describes something about the world around you. Use the word describe to define descriptive. So first, there's something about us. Yeah. Yeah, so it explains. Descriptive. Descriptive is an explanation, right? It says that this is something you can describe an alternative vision of the future. You're like, we have this thing now, but we could have this other thing. Here's what this other thing would be at school. So we have capitalism now, but we could have communism, and we're going to describe communism and how that operates, right? Or it could be proscriptive. What does it mean for something to be proscriptive? Any ideas? Has anyone ever been prescribed medicine by their doctor? I can't hear any of you. All of you need to be like twice as loud when you talk, please.
But it was prescribed, not proscribed.
Yeah, it is technically a little different, but same in general theory. You prescribe medicine, the doctor says you should take this medicine, to resolve your illness. If something is proscriptive, then it says, maybe I spelled it wrong. I don't know. It just means that it describes a series of acts. I spelled it wrong, yeah? No? Okay. You're just confusing me more. It describes a series of actions that should be taken, right? So a descriptive alternative says this is an alternative system that would be better than the system that the affirmative is implicit. A proscriptive alternative says here are the steps that we need to take to get to an alternative system. Is that just clear? Yeah. Yeah, so the best alternatives will be both descriptive and proscriptive. They'll describe the vision for the future, and then they'll also say these are the steps we need to take to get to that vision. But a lot of times alternatives are not both descriptive and proscriptive. They'll be one or the other, but the best alternative certainly will be both. Yeah. So the question was, if it's too proscriptive, doesn't it leave room for the purpose solved? Certainly possible. Depends on what the alternative is, particularly what the affirmative does. In general, I would err towards more description, or towards more detail than less detail. The kind of more detailed you can describe what the alternative is, the more you can differentiate it from what the affirmative does, improve competition between the two. And it's always just better to explain more of your argument than to try and mystify it. So a lot of calculators have this really bad habit where they try and make the K as confusing as possible by using as many big words, and they won't explain themselves. That's awful. It's a terrible way to debate the K. You should always be trying to explain your argument in the best detail possible so that you can communicate it to the judge. Yeah. Yes. Yo. What's wrong with me this week? You're so quiet.
Yeah.
So when I feel like these people like you propose like that you just reject all like capitalism and everything and then like the first thing would be like we should teach our kids in schools to like or we should teach like anti-capitalism in schools so that they can come up with an alternative.
Close, but not exactly. So one way to think about this is that descriptive alternatives are nouns and proscriptive alternatives are verbs, right? So, for example, if you're like, the alternative is communism. That's a noun, right? And then you describe what communism is. If your alternative is to reject capitalism, that's a verb, right? It's an action that you can take. Rejection is an action that you can take, right? So so that can be another way to think about the distinction between the two. Because reject capitalism is a proscription of an action that can be taken to attempt to resolve the problem of capitalism, right? If you simply describe what communism is, then it would be descriptive. This is the alternative system, but you don't really have a way to get to that alternative system. It's just descriptive. Cool. Any other questions about that? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that the alternative like only matters in the context of the debate round, in the sense that events that happen versus when you're actually like advocating on?
It depends on what critique you're reading. So if you're reading a critique that's like in the tradition of grassroots activism, you might want to make an argument about why it's important for the critique to have effects outside of the debate. But if you're reading a critique that's about knowledge production, then probably the debate is more important. So it just depends on what argument you're reading. There's a large diversity of different types of critiques. Anything else? Perfect. Alternatives generate uniqueness for the impact. So remember how earlier we said that critiques, unlike dissents, don't have uniqueness? They do have impacts and links, but they don't have uniqueness. So what is uniqueness for a disadvantage? Someone I haven't heard? Green Dinosaur?
Oh, we heard from that.
Huh?
No, you heard from
Oh, okay. Okay. Anyone was uniqueness for disadvantage? Yeah. Right. So uniqueness is a description of the status quo. And in particular, for a disadvantage, uniqueness says that the status quo is fine. That everything's going swell and the plan's going to screw it up. Right? A critique usually doesn't start from the presumption that everything's going well, right? The critique is criticizing something that's occurring, so it says, you know, there's actually this system of power that's occurring right now, and it's really messed up in a lot of ways, and things are not going well, right? So we need to somehow generate uniqueness, because, you know, if you're criticizing capitalism, the DREAM Act is probably not what's going to make or break capitalism, right? Like, it's not like capitalism is going to imminently collapse, but then we can pass the DREAM Act and suddenly it's, you know, saved forever. That's a nonsensical argument that you're not going to win. So you don't have a uniqueness argument, right? You don't have an argument that in the status quo, everything's going to be great until the plan happens. But you use the alternative to generate that uniqueness. You say, in the status quo, everything's awful. The act is part of that awfulness. We have an alternative. We have a different vision for what the future could be that doesn't include both the awful things happening in the status quo and it doesn't include the affirmative. Because whatever the affirmative is doing is part of the awful things. Right? So this is a very confusing concept. It took me a while to understand it. Yeah. So the question is, if you're running a critique, would you not read a disadvantage? The answer is that you can definitely read critiques with disadvantages, but most of the time, you have to choose in the debate which one to go for. Sometimes that's not always true, but as a general rule, you'll have to either go for the disadvantage or the critique in the 2 and R. But because the negative's job, and this is